All right, welcome everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive into, the Black Death.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's one of the most impactful events in human history, I think it's safe to say. The bubonic plague pandemic that just swept across Europe and beyond. It lasted from 1346 to 1353.
It's a pretty bleak chapter.
Yeah, for sure. But also super fascinating. We're using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the Black Death, accessed on March 12, 2025.
Okay.
We'll be uncovering all kinds of fascinating facts about its origins, how it spread, and just the profound consequences it had on the world.
I think a lot of people don't realize how much it changed, well, everything.
Right, like how deadly was this plague, really, and what were the lasting impacts on society, economics, even our understanding of disease? That's what we're going to find out.
It really is a sobering but also just super fascinating chapter in human history.
It really is. So first things first, the name itself, Black Death. It sounds like something straight out, like a horror movie, right? But was it always called that?
That's a great question. Actually, the name Black Death didn't become, popular until much later. The 14th century, during the time it was happening, it was mostly described as the Great Pestilence, or sometimes simply the Great Mortality.
Okay.
The term atremors, that's Latin for Black Death, was also used, but it didn't become the, dominant name until centuries later.
Huh. Interesting. So the name itself kind of evolved, as people learned more about this terrifying disease.
Right.
But here's something that's always blown my mind. This wasn't humanity's first encounter with the plague, was it?
Nope, not at all.
Uh,
The Black Death was actually part of a much larger pandemic event. It's what we call the Second Plague Pandemic, which, get this, continued for centuries. And even before that, there was the devastating plague of Justinian, which ravaged the Byzantine Empire way back in the 6th century.
So the plague has this long and terrifying history going back centuries.
Well, yeah, for sure. And, recent research suggests it might even go back further than that. Some studies have found evidence of plague infections dating as far back as, the Neolithic Bronze Age. So, this disease has been a shadow over humanity for millennia, potentially.
Wow, that's incredible. So for centuries, people lived in fear of this mysterious and deadly disease, but they didn't even understand what caused it, right?
No, not at all. I mean, imagine living in a world without, the knowledge of bacteria or viruses.
Right.
People came up with all sorts of theories to explain the plague, like planetary alignments, miasma, or what they call bad air, divine punishment.
Yeah.
They were grasping at straws, really just trying to make sense of this invisible killer.
That must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
But luckily, we have a better understanding today. We know the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis.
Exactly, yes. And the discovery of Y. pestis is a fascinating story in itself. In 1894, a Swiss-French physician, Alexandre Yersin, isolated the bacterium during an outbreak in Hong Kong. This was like a major breakthrough in our understanding of the plague.
So how does this bacterium actually spread? Is it really all about the infamous rats?
Well, rats definitely play a key role, for sure. The traditional understanding is that Y. pestis is transmitted through fleas that live on rodents, particularly black rats.
Okay.
So when an infected flea feeds on a rat, the bacteria start to multiply in the flea's gut. Eventually, it creates a blockage. And because of this blockage, the flea becomes incredibly hungry and starts biting more aggressively. And then it can regurgitate the bacteria into its host. And that host could be another rat or, unfortunately, a human.
Yeah, that's a pretty gruesome way to spread.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
But it's so fascinating, how scientific discoveries have helped us really understand these intricate processes, And speaking of discoveries, it wasn't until pretty recently that we had, definitive proof that Y. pestis was the actual culprit behind the Black Death. In 2010, researchers used DNA evidence from skeletons in, mass graves across Europe, and they were able to confirm its presence.
Yeah, it was like solving a centuries-old cold case.
Right. So case closed. Y. pestis and those pesky rats caused the Black Death.
Well, maybe not so fast. Well, Y. pestis is undoubtedly the cause. There's still some debate about, the primary mode of transmission.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Some researchers are challenging the traditional rat flea hypothesis. They're suggesting that human fleas and lice might have actually been more significant vectors, especially for the Black Death's rapid spread.
So maybe it wasn't all about the rats.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, there was research in 2018 that provided evidence suggesting that human-to-human transmission, through these parasites could actually explain the plague's rapid spread more accurately than the rat flea model. So it's still being debated in the scientific community.
Wow. So even centuries later, we're still learning new things about the Black Death. It's like history's full of mysteries, and our understanding of the past is always evolving.
That's what makes it so fascinating.
That really is. But, regardless of exactly how it spread, one thing's for sure, it left an absolutely devastating impact on the world.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we're going to explore further as we continue our deep dive.
All right, sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive on the Black Death. Last time we were talking about the plague's cause and all those competing theories about how it actually spread.
It's a puzzle with lots of pieces, even, centuries later.
It really is. So let's shift gears a bit and try to trace the plague's journey. Where did this pandemic begin and how did it spread so rapidly across the globe?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, the Black Death wasn't just this isolated event. It was part of this much larger pandemic, the Second Plague pandemic, that lasted for centuries. But the origins of this particular outbreak, the one we call the Black Death, those are still debated.
Right. And our source mentions a few possibilities. What's the most likely theory based on what we know now?
Well, based on current research, Central Asia seems to be the most likely starting point. There's evidence pointing to an outbreak near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan. Researchers have discovered some inscriptions in Nestorian Christian grave sites from the 1330s that describe a devastating pestilence.
Nestorian Christian grave sites. Can you explain that a bit more? I think some of our listeners might not be familiar with that term.
Oh, yeah, sure. So Nestorian Christianity was it was a branch of early Christianity that spread eastward, reaching as far as China. They had their own, kind of unique doctrines and practices. And finding these inscriptions, in their grave sites, it provides a glimpse into the impact of the plague on those communities.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So are these inscriptions almost like early warning signs of the approaching pandemic?
Precisely, yeah. And these inscriptions aren't the only evidence either. Researchers have also discovered Y pestis DNA in teeth from those same graves. It further supports the theory that the plague was present in Central Asia right around that time.
It's amazing how scientists can piece together these historical events using these modern techniques like DNA analysis. It's like a detective story unfolding across centuries.
Absolutely, it's really incredible what they can do now.
It is. But the story doesn't end there, right? From Central Asia, the plague traveled westward, eventually reaching Europe. One key turning point, it seems, was the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea. Have you heard about what happened there?
Oh, yes, Kaffa. Now, that's a story. You're talking about the siege.
Yeah, I think I read something about a siege and catapults.
Yes. In 1346, Kaffa was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde army. And get this, the Mongols, they were suffering from the plague themselves. So they did something pretty horrific. They catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls.
Oh my gosh, that's just awful. It's like something out of a nightmare.
It's gruesome. But unfortunately for the people of Kaffa, it was also effective. The plague spread within the city, and then fleeing Genoese traders, they carried the disease with them on their ships, unknowingly spreading it across the Mediterranean as they fled.
It's like this chain reaction almost. The plague hitching a ride on these ships and reaching new ports.
Yeah, exactly. And it shows how interconnected the world was even back then. By the summer of 1347, the plague had reached Constantinople, which was, this bustling capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city was hit hard. Thousands died, including the emperor's own son. Can you imagine the fear, the panic?
It's hard to fathom the scale of the tragedy. And from there, the plague continued to spread rapidly, right?
Like wildfire. By January 1348, ships carrying, infected individuals landed in Messina, Sicily. From there, it quickly spread to mainland Italy, reaching those major port cities like Genoa and Venice. And think about it. This was a time without cars, trains, planes, yet the plague managed to move with astonishing speed, reaching France, Spain, and Portugal within months. By 1350, it had swept through Germany, Scandinavia, and even parts of Russia.
This is where it starts to feel, truly global, reaching almost every corner of the known world at that time.
It's a testament to how interconnected those trade routes were even in the 14th century. But, we can't lose sight of the human element here. This wasn't just about maps and timelines. This was a human tragedy of just immense proportions. Behind the dates and place names are countless stories of suffering and loss.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get kind of caught up in the big picture, but the real impact was felt by, individuals and communities. And our source mentions some pretty chilling firsthand accounts.
Yeah, one that stands out to me is the account of Agnolo di Tura. He was a chronicler from Siena, Italy. And he describes burying his own 5 children, victims of the plague. And his words, they just paint this vivid picture of the terror, the despair that gripped the city, bodies piling up in the streets, mass graves overflowing, just this constant fear of death hanging over everyone.
It's heartbreaking to read. His account really brings home the human cost of this pandemic.
It does, and Siena wasn't alone. Similar scenes were playing out across Europe and beyond.
So we've talked about the plague's origins, its rapid spread, and just the devastating impact on individuals and communities. But what about the wider consequences? How did this pandemic actually reshape the world?
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It triggered these profound social, economic, and cultural transformations that, reverberated for centuries.
Yeah, and that's what I find so fascinating about history. It's like these seemingly isolated events can have these ripple effects that change the course of civilizations.
You got it. And the Black Death is a prime example of that.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Black Death. We've been tracing the plague's journey from its origins in Central Asia to its just devastating sweep across Europe. And now let's talk about the aftermath. I mean, it wasn't just about the immediate deaths, right? This pandemic reshaped the world in some really profound ways.
You're absolutely right. The Black Death's impact extended far beyond the initial death toll. It's estimated that somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population perished during the Black Death. Can you imagine? Like, entire communities wiped out, families just decimated.
Yeah, it's hard to even comprehend the scale of that loss. And as you said, it wasn't just about the numbers. The plague had this ripple effect on every aspect of society.
Exactly. One of the most immediate and significant consequences was the economic upheaval. The massive loss of life led to a severe labor shortage. With fewer workers available, those who survived were suddenly in high demand.
So basic economics, right? Supply and demand kicked in. Did that mean workers were suddenly able to demand higher wages?
Yes, exactly. Wages they soared as landowners and employers competed for that remaining workforce. I mean, in some places, wages doubled or even tripled. This shift in economic power had a profound impact on the feudal system, which was based on the labor of peasants tied to the land.
So the Black Death really challenged those long-held social structures. What happened to the feudal lords who relied on that peasant labor?
Well, they faced a crisis. With fewer peasants to work the land and pay taxes, the feudal system began to just crumble. Many landowners struggled to maintain their estates, and some were forced to sell their land or, grant concessions to their remaining tenants.
That's a pretty dramatic shift in power dynamics. But if workers were earning more, wasn't that a good thing?
Well, it's not quite that straightforward. While higher wages initially benefited workers, they also triggered this wave of inflation. The prices of goods and services skyrocketed as the reduced workforce struggled to meet demand. So the economic gains for workers were often offset by that rising cost of living.
So it sounds like a complicated and chaotic time.
Right.
Beyond just the economic upheaval, what were some of the other social consequences of the Black Death?
The plague also had this profound impact on religious beliefs and social attitudes. Some people saw the pandemic as divine punishment, and this led to an increase in religious fervor and piety. Others questioned their faith altogether. They struggled to understand why God would allow such suffering.
It's a question that's echoed through history in the face of tragedy. How could a loving God allow such devastation?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to grapple with, and sadly, the fear and uncertainty surrounding the plague led to some very dark consequences as well. In many places, people turned against minorities, blaming them for the pandemic.
So instead of, looking for scientific explanations or trying to understand the true cause of the plague, they looked for scapegoats.
Exactly. The most common targets were Jews, Romani people, foreigners, and those who were already marginalized in society. They were accused of poisoning wells, spreading disease, practicing witchcraft. This led to persecution, violence, even massacres in some communities.
It's a chilling reminder of how fear and ignorance can fuel prejudice and hatred.
Right.
Even in the face of this shared threat, people turned on each other.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter in human history. But it's important to remember, These events demonstrate how easily fear can be manipulated to incite violence and target vulnerable groups.
It's a lesson that unfortunately remains relevant even today.
It does, sadly.
But amidst all the darkness and despair, were there also like glimmers of hope and resilience? Did the Black Death force people to adapt, innovate, and find new ways to cope with the challenges they faced?
Oh, absolutely. For example, the labor shortage led to advancements in agriculture and technology. With fewer workers available, there was this need for more efficient farming techniques and tools. The plague also contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of new economic systems. In a way, it paved the way for the Renaissance and the emergence of a more urbanized society.
So in a way, the Black Death, while devastating, also acted as this catalyst for change, leading to new ways of thinking and new ways of like organizing society.
Yeah, it's a complex and multifaceted legacy. The Black Death wasn't just a single event, but rather a turning point in history with consequences that rippled out across, centuries.
We've been focusing on the immediate and long-term impacts of the Black Death in Europe, but it's important to remember that this was a global pandemic. How did the Black Death affect other parts of the world?
That's a great point. The Black Death spread to the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, leaving a similar trail of devastation. It impacted, trade routes, political structures, and cultural practices across these regions. The effects varied depending on, local conditions, but the overall impact was significant.
It's a reminder that pandemics don't respect borders or boundaries. They affect all of humanity, highlighting our interconnectedness.
Exactly. And even though the initial, outbreak of the Black Death subsided, the plague didn't disappear entirely. It continued to reappear in Europe and other parts of the world for centuries, with these recurring outbreaks that claimed countless lives. What we call the Second Plague Pandemic, which began with the Black Death, it lasted until the 19th century.
Wow. So the plague continued to cast a shadow over the world for generations. That's a sobering thought.
It is. But thankfully, we now have a much better understanding of the disease and how to treat it. Modern medicine has given us antibiotics and other treatments that are effective against the plague. And while there are still cases of plague reported each year, it's no longer the global threat it once was.
Right. That's reassuring to hear, but it also makes you wonder if the Black Death were to happen today in our modern interconnected world with all the global travel and dense urban populations, would we be more or less vulnerable?
That's an excellent question, and one that public health experts are constantly grappling with. While we have the benefit of modern medicine, the speed and ease of global travel could potentially facilitate the rapid spread of a disease like the plague. Right. It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant and prepared.
Yeah.
We have to invest in public health infrastructure and really learn from the lessons of the past.
Yeah. It's a reminder that history can teach us valuable lessons, both about the resilience of the human spirit, but also the importance of preparedness. Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Black Death. It's been a journey through darkness and devastation, but also a testament to human ingenuity and our ability to overcome, even the most daunting challenges. If you're eager to learn more, I encourage you to check out the full Wikipedia article and other resources on this, fascinating and important topic. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious.